Okay, well, welcome everybody. We've still got a few more coming in. Welcome everybody to this month's supporters evening. Thank you for your continued support. Thank you to first timers who've joined us for this one, and thanks to old hands as well who've come along um, for an evening where I'm going to tempt you to spend even more of your money, probably when we when we look at some books. But first of all, I thought I'd just kind of it's quite nice to be able to occasionally tie into one or two things connected to the podcast itself. Um, so I'm just going to pin myself there for a minute, and then I'm just going to share my screen. Bear with me. That. Bear with me. Okay. So I just thought we would just have a kind of little look at something that came up in a recent podcast episode about headstone badges, and it's something that's interested me for a long time. I kind of went round when the weather's been particularly good, and the shadows have been right in the headstones. Over the years, I wouldn't say I've copied every single badge, but I've certainly photographed quite a lot of them. And the question in the Q&A, in case you haven't listened to it yet, was about battalion cap badges being used on headstones. Why was this done, and what kind of different types were there? And it was in particular reference to the King's Liverpool Regiment, which I'll come on to in this as well. So the most common form of battalion badges are territorial force units, so part-time soldiers, territorial soldiers. And the London Regiment, which before the war had 26 individual battalions, had a cap badge for each one. Some of them borrowed from other units they were affiliated to, like the first, second, third, and fourth Londons were Royal Fusilier battalions, and they had a Royal Fusilier style badge, slightly different, but certainly kind of to the naked eye, as it were, it looks very similar. But others had very ornate and very different kinds of badges. So this is 16th Battalion London Regiment Queen's Rifles, and that's the portcullis of the Borough of Westminster as part of their badge, which forms the centerpiece of their badge, which is a Maltese cross in black. So you get these kind of um, badges as well. Sorry, I'm just letting a few more in. And then if we go to the next one, this is the Kensington. So this is symbols relating to the borough of Kensington. This is the 13th Battalion, the London Regiment. And I'm not going to go through all 26 battalions of London Regiment, but this kind of gives you a bit of an idea of the type of cap badges that are out there for individual battalions, particularly ones like the London Regiment. The Cambridgeshire Regiment would be another good example, and so on. But within Kitchener's army, within the new army, there were a lot of badges that were struck for new units because they had their own kind of identifying symbol. They wanted to be slightly different. And one of those was the Tyneside Scottish and Irish. And this is just an example of the Tyneside Scottish. So part of the Northumberland Fusiliers, whose cap badge is normally a flaming bomb, as most Fusilier regiments are, because they wore a Glengarry, this badge was struck. It's quite a large badge, actually, in real life, that sits in the Glengarry, and it kind of symbolises what they are, which is the Tyneside Scottish, men of Scottish origin who lived in Tyneside, of which there were quite a few. And there was an Irish Tyneside Irish cap badge as well, which was a harp. But you kind of get the idea. And the question in the podcast was about the King's Liverpool Regiment. So this is a standard King's Liverpool Regiment grave. This is at One Core Cemetery near Arras. And you can see it's got the standard regimental cap badge, which is the White Horse of Hanover. The Hanoverians, I'm not sure they ever made a program what the Hanoverians did for us, but they kind of did quite a lot, really, because 100 years before the Great War, the King of England was a Hanoverian. And many of our regiments had Hanoverian connections, which is why you see this white horse symbol, which is the symbol of the Hanoverian state. And that's the normal King's Liverpool Regiment cap badge. But because they formed a number of units, both wartime and pre-war territorial ones, they have one of the largest number of different regimental cap badges. The most famous one, which I mentioned in the podcast, is for the Liverpool POWs, which this is the headstone version of that, which shows a bird swooping over a child in a cradle. You can kind of just about see the child with two eyes and a wide open mouth crying. And that's, of course, the liver bird. And this was the symbol of the Derby family. Lord Derby, who formed the Liverpool POWs, wanted them to have their own special badge, as he formed 4 battalions of over 4,000 men, which were essentially his own private army, because in the first months of their existence, he paid for everything: their wages, their equipment, their weapons, their billets, everything, until the War Office took over in 1915. So he could kind of circumvent the situation in terms of what would have been Army Council instructions, I suspect, in terms of what badges should be worn, and then have this badge struck again at his own expense, in this case in silver, and over 4,000 of these badges handed out to every single person in the 4 battalions, from private to lieutenant colonel. And if you'll excuse the French, they rather ungraciously nicknamed it the Duck and Bastard, which I think was a kind of a pre-war name for the family symbol, because Lord Derby was a big landowner in the kind of wider Liverpool area. But they must have thought, I can't remember reading that years ago, but they must have thought something of it, because the number of those silver badges that I've seen come up for sale over the years that are beautifully engraved with the soldiers' details on the reverse, they must have thought something of it. And there was a later bronze version of it issued as well. But in the territorial battalions of the King's Liverpool Regiment, they had a Liverpool Rifles 6th Battalion, and this is their cap badge. So it's got a light infantry symbol, which is the bugle. It's got the Rose of Lancaster on there, and mention of the Liverpool Regiment. So they had their own cap badge, and that was shown on the headstones of men from the 6th Battalion, both the 1st 6 and the 2nd 6, who served in different divisions on different parts of the Western Front. And then one of the more famous ones was the Liverpool Scottish, which also had its own large Glengarry badge, which is perpetuated on the headstones. So it's a fascinating thing, really. I mean, one of the things that which I think I mentioned in the podcast, they looked at doing for the Canadians separate cap badges for all the different Canadian battalions. And if they'd have just stuck to the 4 Canadian divisions that served on the Western Front, that alone would have been 50 odd different cap badges that they've had to have come up with. But what you often see when you look at headstones of guys in the CEF, Canadian Expeditionary Force, you often see mention of their previous CEF battalion. So there might have been a requirement to do more. And I think there was something like 268 battalions in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. So in theory, they'd have to come up with templates with 268 headstone badges, which was considered too much. So they used national symbol, which is the maple leaf for Canadians. And the Australians didn't have regimental badges, so the Rising Sun badge became theirs. The New Zealanders also had badges like the Canadians for reinforcement drafts and their different regiments, and that was simplified into the fern symbol for New Zealand. So it's interesting, really. And I think the Commission have got the original drawings of these, if I remember correctly. If not all of them, they've got quite a lot of them. And it shows that, I mean, the intricate nature of what had to be engraved. And when we think that then, compared to now, then these were all hand engraved, it really is quite extraordinary to think that this kind of intricate work was done by hundreds of stonemasons, all British, that were working in these depots behind the lines, creating the headstone badges and engraving the rest of the headstone with the details on. An amazing piece of work, now just all done on computer. If you've been to the Commonwealth War Graves Commission experience at Beaurain, then you will have seen the machines they use to get it up on a screen. It's done by laser. They kind of press a button, go and have a cup of coffee. I mean, that's a slight exaggeration, but they kind of do it that way rather than it's done by hand. But to me, it's what makes these headstones, in their own right, putting the kind of the fact that they are symbols of a life, sacrifice, of service. Putting that to one side, they are in themselves a work of art. And I'm pleased now that the Commission are seeing the historic importance of these headstones and not just replacing them at the drop of a hat. They're kind of thinking about it and preserving them as much as possible. So that's a kind of good element to it. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to share that little aside with you in a way that I couldn't easily do on the podcast itself. So I'm going to stop sharing that now and come back into the main screen. So I think there's a few more just come in, and we'll get down to the subject of books. Now I've got a I wouldn't say it's a pile of shame, because this whole room here is a kind of room of shame, and the rooms outside of this room that have books in are just as potentially shameful when it comes to the amount of books that is in this house. But that's kind of what goes with being fascinated with this subject. So what I thought I'd do, I mean, in that podcast about Somme books, it just was not possible to cover every single book, because we could have just taken one of those layers that I spoke about and spent the rest of the podcast just on that layer, which probably would have been boring to most people, which is why I kind of wanted to dip into each element of it. So I thought we'd follow up with a few more, and I thought we'd start with, and the only way I can do this is kind of hold these books up like this. We'll start with this. Now this is an old book, blue spine, quite difficult to probably see the actual lettering on the side of it. And on the front cover, it says Memories, the Battle of the Somme, 1916. Now, I think this book is one of the very earliest books that was published post-war about the Battle of the Somme. And inside, it starts with a kind of overview of history of the Battle of the Somme. Some of it not entirely accurate. It kind of starts, I'll just show you that it starts with there's a to Douglas Haig, and it moves into the story of the Battle of the Somme, and it runs through the different phases of it. It's got a bit of poetry in there, in memoriam, a poem written by Bentley Capper, whoever that was. It sounds like a kind of made up name, really. And that poem ends, it was a poem written in La Couture, which is in northern France, in the Pas-de-Calais, in November 1917. And it ends with, so in Valhalla or in paradise, thy martyred sons who gladly paid the price, so know that thou wast worth their sacrifice. Yeah, not quite Baldric, but it's interesting. The kind of analogy is the worthiness of sacrifice. So it kind of shows the early nature of it, pre the kind of disillusionment period of books that were published later on in the 1920s. And I'm not sure there is an actual publication date in this, but I would guess it's sometime around about 1920, something like that. Yeah, I'm pretty sure there isn't a date on there. I'm just looking at the frontispiece, and there isn't. It was when I look at the frontispiece to it, there's the king. The Battle of the Somme, 1916, Memories, Souvenir and Roll of Honour, edited by William J. Borland, formerly Duke of Lancaster Own Yeomanry, number 3 Observation Group, Field Survey Company, Royal Engineers. So that's interesting. He was kind of part of a unit that did maps. He might have been a bit ashamed of this kind of map that's in there. That's a kind of very basic map of the Somme, showing the divisions that were in the line and some of the villages, but it's kind of a useful sketch. And then it moves on to a list of units that took part in the Battle of the Somme, and that's probably the first time that that kind of information was ever published. And then it moves on to the rest of the book is a roll of honor. So it's a list of people who died in the Battle of the Somme. Now, not every one of them, because this would be about, well, it'd be the width of this room probably, but I suspect that this was one of what was common then, one of a number of subscription books where you could pay an amount of money and have your relative included in this book. So I'm looking at Lieutenant Kenneth Franklin Barrett, Machine Gun Corps, killed 1st of July 1916, and then they've added some details, born 4th of March 1895, and then a little quotation, heedless and careless, still the world goes on and leaves us broken. Our sons, they too love life, but loving dared not save themselves, lest those they love should pay the price. Sunshine and youth and laughter all they gave in sacrifice. And there's quite a few things like that. And then others, there's more details. Evelyn Bleck, second lieutenant, 73rd Machine Gun Company, killed in the front line where Jackson Trench meets the sunken road that runs southwest from Guillemont. So it's really interesting. And I don't think this kind of roll of honor has ever been kind of data based, so that people can kind of tap into it. So, but it's kind of an interesting first book. I mean, it's not a very common one. I don't think it's massively expensive, and it doesn't really kind of tell you anything about the Battle of the Somme that you probably don't already know. But it's part of the historiography of books that were published on this subject, a very early Somme pioneer, I suppose you could call it. So that's that one, Memories. Then jumping onto that layer where we kind of look at gateway books, and I didn't mention this one simply because there wasn't enough space, but this is a pen and sword. It's one of a 2-volume set by Ed Skelding, and this one looks at the 1st of July. It's, reasonable number of pages. It's got color illustrations and black and white modern shots. In fact, a lot of these are actually from the 1980s and 90s, which actually make it quite interesting. Ed Skelding, who wrote this and the companion volume for the rest of the Battle of the Somme, was a Northeastern TV producer. One or two of you I know from the Northeast, you may remember some of his programs. And he did a really, really good series in late 80s, early 90s, where he looked at the northern regiments that fought in the Great War, particularly the northeastern ones, so like Northumberland Fusiliers and Durham Line Infantry. And that was presented by I think then retired TV presenter who was a veteran of the Second World War. And I remember watching this. It kind of ended up, I don't know, probably randomly shown on BBC Two or something. But it was a really good series with some really, really good stories. And this book and the companion book about the rest of the Somme is pretty much full of those stories. So this is something where you're not going to end up as an expert in the Battle of the Somme by reading this, or the first day of the Somme in this case, but you are going to get some really good kind of stories from it, and the illustrations are good and the maps are good, and it ties into a series of videos that Ed Skelding subsequently did for Pen and Sword, who were the publisher of this, with Nigel Cave, who was the editor of the Battleground Europe series. And I think I don't think they sold very well. They were going to put them on YouTube, I think, at some stage, but that's never been happened. But they're still out there, and occasionally you see them come up quite cheaply. So that's a kind of nice little additional gateway book. Ed Skelding's The Somme 1916, 2 volumes, and this one looking at the 1st of July, which is apt considering the 1st of July is tomorrow. So that's that one. Kind of looking at something that's a little bit more detailed. Some of these books were a ton, I've suddenly realised. Now, as you know, I used to live at Courcelette. It's a village right in the middle of the Somme, Courcelette Cemetery, just behind me there. And the Canadians fought at Courcelette from the 15th September through to the final attack on the 18th of November. It was the first time the Canadian Corps had gone into action in an attack, and the first village in the history of Canada that they liberated in Europe, which has great resonance, in the 80th anniversary year of D-Day and the Battle of Normandy and the subsequent liberation of northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But the Somme, Courcelette, was the first time that they did that in that century, when the Canadian Corps attacked the village on the 15th September, captured it, and the fighting moved to the trench systems beyond, Regina Trench, Desire Trench, and the ground around it. And as some of you know, I wrote a book for Battleground Europe on Courcelette some years ago, which for a long, long while was the only one. Norm Christie did one about the Canadians on the Somme. And then this is the more recent study, which is a much more detailed, up-to-date thing, written by William Stewart, who's a Canadian historian. It's published by Helion, who do a lot of these kind of books. It's kind of semi-academic in its tone, but it's highly detailed on the story of the Canadians in the fighting in the Somme from September to November of 1916, with a separate map volume, which is really, really useful. So you can kind of tie that into the ground it is today, and take this kind of layer of detail and layer that over the top of the landscape as it is today, and he's illustrated it throughout with contemporary images that connect to the fighting at Courcelette. It's a fantastic book. I mean, it's a, you know, having written a book on this subject myself, when I did it, it was the early kind of period of the internet, and you couldn't get access to some stuff without flying out to Canada, which wasn't really feasible for me then. And these kind of books now that are coming along, you know, 2 decades or so later, are really kind of adding a lot more detail to our knowledge of these subjects. And it's a superb kind of basic history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and a really, really detailed account of the Canadians on the Somme in 1916. I haven't read it yet, but I think he's either just published or about to publish a similar volume about 1918. So I'm looking forward to that, because William Stewart, good writer, good historian, and some good kind of perspectives in this as well. So that's that one. And so that's the kind of your next layer. We've had a gateway book, so that's your kind of next layer of detail. And we spoke about unit histories. Now, I spoke about British unit histories predominantly for obvious reasons, because most people can only speak English or read English, but there is a whole plethora of material out there in other languages relating to other nations. And to kind of these kind of books will, I would say, really dent your bank balance if you start searching for these. But with a long-term interest in the fighting around Beaumont Hamel on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, eventually I was going to have to find myself buying this, which is the history of the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment. So this was published in Stuttgart, 1921, where the regiment comes from. It's a beautiful kind of book with this cover, typical of quite a lot of the German unit histories. The Bavarian and Württemberg, this is a Württemberg unit, they published quite a lot of histories. Under these ones are early on, but under the Nazis, quite a lot of other units were given, I think, funds to write history. So you see some of those. Some of those, I think, probably you could be more critical of the way that they write the history. But this is just I suspect, for veterans, for the ones who survived, and for the families of those who were killed. And it's got a whole kind of, in the back, it's got some, I won't try and take them out, it's impossible, but it's got a whole load of maps tucked in a little map section at the back, showing the positions on the Somme, because this unit arrived in the northern Somme sector in the autumn of 1914 and would remain there until the end of the battle in November of 1916. And it's illustrated with private photographs, or the regimental divisional photographers' photographs. So, for example, that is a photograph taken inside the Hawthorne mine crater, showing the crater that was blown there on the 1st of July. So you've got things like that. It's written in a kind of, it's published in a kind of Gothic script, but it is readable. So if you kind of read German, then you shouldn't have any problem with this. With the way Google Translate is kind of moving on these days, I would guess that it won't be long before you can just hover your phone over books like this, and it just instantly translates them for you. And it's got some nice aerial photographs. And you can see that that's one showing the Hawthorne Ridge and the trenches around Beaumont Hamel just before the 1st of July. And of course, what this gives us is the perspective from the other side of no man's land, which is really important to understand. And one of the things I'd have loved to have seen that come out of the centenary is the digitization and availability of all of these German histories, in the same way that the French digitized all of their historiques, their own regimental histories. They're pretty much all online, and there's a couple of different sources where you can find those. So you don't have to spend silly money on a French regimental history. You can just search for it online, and there it is. And some of those have been digitally transferred from the actual original printed text into clickable text, copy and paste it, and again you can run that through a translator, and you can translate it if you don't speak French. So these, though, are kind of beautiful things to have, and I wouldn't want to be buying one of these for every regiment of the of the German army in the Great War, but ones that are of particular interest, I think they're quite nice to have. And they're very, very kind of much, when you look at the design of that, it's very much of the kind of period, which is part of its attraction, I guess. Ironically, I bought that at Ypres, at the Passchendaele Book Fair. If some of you have never been to that, I'd recommend it. It's on the 11th of November every year in a community centre in Passchendaele near the church. And they have a number of dealers there, and a lot of them are kind of dealing German postcards and books and stuff, and so you can find these kind of things. So that's a kind of unit history. And then in terms of memoirs, I didn't mention either of these in it again, because I mean, I've got an entire, well, couple of bookcases of First World War memoirs. Where do you even start with something like that? But two more that I thought I'd just kind of throw into the mix is this one, which is a number of kind of different versions of this. This is My Bit, a Lancashire Fusilier at War, 1914-18 by George Ashurst. George Ashurst served with the 1st Battalion Lancashire Fusiliers at Gallipoli and on the Somme. This edition came out in the 1980s, 1987. This was published, and then it was with an introduction by Richard Holmes, who was pretty much unknown at that point outside of the Western Front Association, where he would regularly give talks. And he wrote an intro for this one and another one from Hill 60 to the Somme, which was the Sergeant Major's War, a guy in the Dorsetshire regiment. George Ashurst, I met at a Western Front meeting. He came along to a WFA meeting in the 1980s, in fact, several times, and I got to meet him through that. So it's always kind of nice to flick through this and read bits of it, thinking of his very strong Lancashire accent when he used to kind of talk about what's in this book. And there's George later on in the conflict after he'd been wounded multiple times. It's a fantastic little memoir. He was an ordinary soldier in a regular battalion, and so it's a view from the ranks, which makes it even more important, because for a long while a lot of these kind of memoirs were dominated by officers' memoirs. So these ones, which are just ordinary soldiers' memoirs, are highly important. There's a few versions of this. I think there is a modern reprint, but you can pick up a paperback version that I think might have even been published by Tom Donovan Books. Don't quote me on that one, but there is a paperback version, which is very easy to get hold of and very cheap on eBay and so on. But it's a great book. That's a highly, highly recommended memoir of the First World War, let alone the Battle of the Somme. And then it's kind of Canada night tonight, because I can't resist throwing this one. This is one of my absolute favourite memoirs of the First World War, again from the ranks, and that is The Journal of Private Fraser. Donald Fraser was a Scotsman who'd emigrated to Canada before the war. That's him there in a goatskin jerkin during the winter of 1915 with his Ross rifle. And he served on the Western Front for 3 years with the 31st Battalion Canadian Infantry, and then latterly with the Canadian Machine Gun Corps. And the most interesting bits of the book for me are when he's an ordinary soldier in the 31st Battalion up at Ypres for a big long period in 1915 on into early 1916. So he's down on the Messines sector, and then in the Battle of the St. Loire Craters, and then his battalion goes down, and on the 15th September 1916 they are in the attack at Courcelette, and he describes that in great detail, going into the sugar factory, sugar trench, capture of that kind of ground, and then onwards to the sunken lane on the eastern side of the village, and then they remained in that sector up until the kind of October battles as well. And I became particularly interested in the 31st Battalion as a consequence of this. I was put onto this book by the only Canadian veteran that I got to interview, Lance Catamol, who served in the 21st Battalion, the same division, 2nd Canadian Division, who recommended it as one of the best books that he'd read as a veteran of the Great War. And then in those days, it was, again, we're talking about pre-internet days back in the 1980s. I managed to find a copy through a mate in Seattle, and it took months to arrive by post, but boy, was it worth it. I mean, it's a fantastic book. It's been reprinted a few times. CF Books, which was Norm Christie, did it in the late 90s, early 2000s. So I don't think it's difficult to get hold of, but it really is a super book. And the thing about Fraser is that he was a highly observant guy. He kept a diary during the war. Then he rewrote that diary in the mid-interwar period. but he used to go off on these kind of cook's tours where he'd just go off and look at stuff. And in here, when we come back to the Somme, for example, when they're waiting to go up to Courcelette, he goes off and he looks at the ground behind their lines, which has been fought over in the early phase of the Battle of the Somme. And there's a really great description in here, for example, of going to the Lochnagar crater, and he walks all around it, and he talks about the field graves of men that he finds buried along the lip of the crater, which included Lieutenant Colonel Henniker of the Tynesiders, whose grave is now in Overless Cemetery. So there's a huge amount of detail in this, and kind of every time I dip back into it for a particular reason, I find more and more little stories, and it really is it definitely in the top 10 memoirs of the Great War, and certainly in the top 5 of the Battle of the Somme. So that's a first edition, the first one that was ever published, but there's a few more since. The Journal of Private Fraser, following Don Fraser around the Western Front for that key period of the war. So that's kind of a couple of memoirs, and just to show, well, there's one more to come, because just to show, I mean, I've been reading books on the Great War for a long time, and I would never say about any aspect of the Great War that I kind of know it all. And that's one of the great things about it, is that you continuously learn with this subject, with any aspect of military history. And last week, I was on a Normandy tour, so kind of nothing to do with the old front line of the Western Front and the Great War. But there was a group of people from Barnsley in my group, and one of them was talking to me, and he was quite interested in the First World War, and he picked up a book in a charity shop in Barnsley, and he was just finishing reading. He said, when I've read it, he said, you can have it. He said, because it was only like 50p, and you're more than welcome to it. So he very kindly gave me it. And it was this book here. It's just a little paperback. Thank you, Mr. Bosch. And that's close enough, it says. Thank you, Mr. Bosch. That's close enough. I mean, they've spelled Bosch, Bosh, which I guess is the Barnsley spelling. No, he's not from Barnsley, this lad. There should be a C in there. It's the memoirs and letters of Major Herbert Hoskins, MC, who was in the territorial battalion of the Royal Warwicks in the 48th South Midland Division. And it starts in Flanders. It's a privately published thing by a company in Cirencester, Miro Books, which I've never heard of. And this book I've never come across before. And it's just basically kind of, there it is. It's kind of just day-by-day accounts taken from his letters and diaries, illustrated with some contemporary photographs, and also some sketches that kind of look as if they've been done fairly recently, rather than by the veteran himself. But it's nicely done. And as with all of these kind of collections of memoirs and letters, you get something from it. It talks about particular places down again on the Messines sector, quite close to where Fraser was, and talks about being in the billets there, Wolvergum and so on. And then he gets down to the Somme, and there's a lot of accounts of different weapons, new weapons that were coming in. There's a picture there of a Tickler's plum and apple jam tin that's been turned into a jam tin bomb. That's from the Royal Warwickshire Regiment Museum. It's a replica one, but it kind of shows different aspects of it. And, I kind of think to myself that the centenary brought a lot of these kind of books and a lot of these kind of memoirs, collections of letters and all that kind of stuff out of cupboards and out of lofts. And I wonder how many other privately printed little books like this that are out there that don't have ISBN numbers, so they don't end up in the British Library, and kind of can easily slip through the net, but they can add so much in terms of our kind of layers, really, of knowledge of the Great War. So I've no idea. I can't believe that this book, I mean, he picked it up for 50p, but I can't believe it's kind of ultra rare and ultra expensive. But if you're into the Warwicks, or you want to read kind of an officer's account of 1915-16, it's a really good little book to pick up. And again, just shows how the Great War can continue to surprise you in terms of what keeps popping up. And I'm not sure whether we find it or whether it finds us. So yeah, and I'm just reminded by looking at this that he was killed. It's quite appropriate as well, because he was killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. There's his memorial scroll. He was killed with the Warwickshires up at Serre near the Heidenkopf on the 1st of July 1916. So yeah, that's one to kind of look out for. And I thought I'd end, some of these antique kind of programs always end with a wild card. And I thought I'd end with a wild card. We've kind of looked, and this is not a layer that I spoke about in the podcast actually, but one element of collecting books connected to a subject like the Battle of the Somme or the Great War kind of generally is commemoration. So there are rolls of honor and things like that. And I've kind of looking over there, I've got quite a few university and college rolls of honor. I've got the Bond of Sacrifice, which is the biographies of officers who were killed in the first 2 years of the war, and one or two others. I mean, that again is kind of, they can seriously dent your piggy banks if you go and start looking for them. Although Naval and Military Press, to be fair, have reprinted quite a lot of those in quite good reprints, but there's that element to it. But the other thing is cemetery registers, and that is an example of it, for which I'll come to in a minute. So cemetery registers, which I mentioned, I think in other podcasts, were published after the war, and in France there were 1,896 cemeteries. In Belgium, I think just under 480. And then other theatres of war, there were multiple registers for the cemeteries and memorials there as well, and they were published in softback books, with this one of two exceptions, which in a minute. And people could buy them for certain amounts. It's quite expensive, so not everyone did. And then libraries had bound copies of them so that the public could go there and look up a relative and read the details. And over the years, those libraries have sold these bound volumes off. I mean, just this year, I bought a complete set of all the registers bound for Belgium. So covering all the cemeteries at Ypres and the wider area of Belgium itself for the First World War. And that had once been in Bradford Library, and Bradford Library had sold it off, and a book dealer bought it from Bradford Library, and it ended up with me. But you see individual copies of registers quite frequently. And I had I can't remember if it was a tweet or an email about this, with someone saying, how did I know that they weren't registers that had been stolen from cemeteries? Because in the cemeteries themselves, there are lockers, and the registers were tucked in those lockers with a visitor's book. This style, old style of register, was discontinued in the early 1990s and eventually replaced with printed modern versions of it, particularly when they scanned all of these and did their first database, which was subsequently released on the internet in the late 90s. And I'm not saying these were never stolen. I'm sure a few of them disappeared in the Second World War. I remember going into a junk shop in Albert where they had some. Who knows? I mean, there was a Commonwealth War Graves Commission depot in Albert where they probably had piles of these things. But virtually all the ones that I've bought over the years have either come from the War Graves Commission direct, because when I first started doing this, you could buy these original ones like this direct from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission still, and they charged only 50p a copy in those days. So I kind of bought as many as I could. And then eventually they got rid of all them. And the ones that I've bought in recent years have come off things like eBay, military deals, but they almost always come with a little bit of ephemera paperwork in them, where it's a picture of a guy who's actually buried in the cemetery, or it's a photograph of his grave, or some war graves paperwork. And those ones, they've not been stolen, they've come down through the family. They're ones that people have bought. And others are just I mean, they're almost mint condition. So there's no way they've been locked in a cemetery register box in -20 on the Somme, which wasn't uncommon back in the day. But this one is a particularly unusual one, of which I bought quite recently. I've been after these. It's the register for France 2, as we can see at the top here. And I've also got the one for France 1. And these were the first two experimental cemeteries that were made in the 1920s, which are Le Tréport, which is #1, and Forceville, which is #2. And Forceville is on the Somme. And these are hardback books, which the later registers were not. These were the only ones published in hardback, and they're different from some of the later registers, which is interesting in its own right. They had some nice plates showing the cemetery itself, which they had thought about doing for all of the registers, but it was eventually abandoned. This one was published in 1920. They have the history section, and this is one of the reasons I buy these, because the history section in these original registers is often much more detailed than what is online now. It's not that the commission have dumbed it down, it's just that they've shortened it, I guess. And some of the detail in one or two of these isn't correct, so they've corrected that. And then there's a map of where the cemetery is located, a plan of the cemetery, and then the early ones, which the other ones did not do, list all of the units that are in the cemetery and how many graves there are from each one, which is really interesting information. That the only other way to do that is to tabulate that yourself. And then it moves on to the actual commemorations with an entry per person. And for most of these, because these are early cemeteries and early registers, there's actually a lot more detail. And it's laid out in a slightly different way. So, and for example, there's one here, Private John Clay, 11th Battalion Royal Irish Rifles, died of wounds 28th of March 1916, age 18, son of Mrs. Clay and the late Thomas Clay of Lambeg, Lisbon, County Antrim, Ireland. And it says the inscription on the original wooden cross erected by his comrades reads, "Soldier, rest thy warfare hour, sleep the sleep that knows no breaking, dream of fighting fields no more, day of toil and night of waiting." So, I mean, that you kind of don't see that in later registers. And I think they did as much as possible for these early ones, and then realized that we're going to have to publish nearly 2,000 of these things with hundreds of thousands of names in there and compile some of this information from next of kin. And it was going to be an absolutely, excuse the pun, monumental task. So they kind of thinned it down. They rationalized it, or whatever phrase that we're going to use. But they're fascinating documents, and they're well worth looking out for. And you can get them often really cheaply on eBay. I mean, there's plenty of jokers on there knocking them out like 70, 80 pound a volume, but you don't have to pay anywhere near like that, anything like that normally. But they're really quite useful, I find, for tapping into some of the original information. So that was the kind of wild card, a cemetery register. So there we are. So that's a few additional things for you to spend your pennies on. And I hope that's been a kind of interesting supplement to the much downloaded episode relating to Somme books. Now, I did put out the idea that some of you might want to bring your own favourite Somme book and talk about it. So what we'll do for the next bit, if anyone's got any questions about any of those books, then by all means pop your hand up. I'm just going to pause the recording